My son Marcus discovered the for sale sign on what he thought was his inheritance and realized I'd already pocketed every last cent. His face went through more emotions than I'd seen in 20 years. But this story isn't about revenge or greed. It's about what happens when we mistake kindness for weakness, and when a mother finally decides her worth is more than the dust she's expected to clean. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At 70 years old, I found myself on my knees scrubbing the bathroom floor of the house I'd called home for 45 years. Not because I wanted to, but because my son Marcus had given me a schedule. Yes, a cleaning schedule, typed up and laminated, with my daily duties listed by the hour. "Mom, since you're living here rent-free, the least you can do is keep the place spotless," he'd announced 6 months earlier when he'd moved back in after his third divorce. Think of it as earning your keep. The house that I'd maintained for decades, where I'd raised 3 children and nursed my husband through his final illness, had somehow become a place where I needed to earn my keep. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me as I scrubbed tile grout with a toothbrush, because Marcus complained the bathroom wasn't hotel clean. I paused, my arthritic knees protesting against the cold tile, and caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked exhausted, defeated. Nothing like the vibrant woman who'd once run this household with grace and efficiency, raising 3 children while managing my husband Robert's medical practice as his office manager, for 30 years. What Marcus didn't know, what he'd never bothered to discover in his relentless treatment of me as unpaid household staff, was that his assumptions about the house, about my finances, and about my options were about to cost him everything he thought was already his. The transformation from mother to maid had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. When Marcus moved back home after his third marriage imploded, something about irreconcilable differences that sounded suspiciously like the same issues that had ended his previous 2 marriages. I'd welcomed him with open arms. He was my youngest, my baby boy, even at 45 years old. "It's just temporary, Mom," he'd assured me, dropping his suitcases in his old bedroom. "Just until I get back on my feet. The divorce really cleaned me out." I'd believed him. Why wouldn't I? This was the same boy I'd nursed through chickenpox, cheered at Little League games, and supported through an expensive business degree that he'd insisted would set him up for life. The fact that he'd squandered every opportunity, every business, venture ending in failure or legal troubles, hadn't dimmed my maternal hope that he'd eventually find his way. The first few weeks had been almost pleasant. We'd eaten dinner together, watched old movies, and he'd even helped with some minor repairs around the house. But gradually, subtly, the dynamic shifted. His temporary stay stretched from weeks to months, and his initial gratitude morphed into something else entirely: entitlement. It started with small comments. "Mom, the kitchen's looking a bit grimy, don't you think?" Or, "These sheets smell musty. When's the last time you washed them properly?" I'd brush off these observations, attributing them to stress from his divorce. But the comments escalated. "You know, Mom, this place is pretty big for just you. You're not getting any younger. Maybe you should think about downsizing." This while he sprawled across the leather sofa I'd bought with Robert, his feet up on the coffee table, leaving ring marks from his beer bottles. Then came the schedule. I'll never forget that morning. I'd come downstairs to find Marcus at the kitchen table with his laptop, printer whirring beside him. He looked up with a smile. That didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, Mom. I've been thinking. Since you're home all day anyway, and I'm working," a generous description of his sporadic consulting gigs, "it makes sense to have a system for keeping the house in order. I've made us a cleaning schedule." He slid the laminated sheet across the table. My name, just Mom, not even Dorothy, was listed next to every single task: bathroom cleaning, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Kitchen deep clean. Tuesday. Laundry. Thursday. Dusting and vacuuming. Daily. The list went on, itemizing every conceivable household chore with military precision. "Where's your name?" I asked, scanning. "The sheet." Marcus chuckled. "Come on, Mom. I'm out there trying to rebuild my career. You're retired. It's only logical." I wanted to remind him that my retirement consisted of a modest pension and Social Security, hardly the golden parachute he seemed to imagine. I wanted to point out that I'd worked full-time while raising 3 children and managing a household. I wanted to scream that being 70 didn't make me his personal maid. Instead, I said nothing. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the hope that this was temporary, that once he got back on his feet, things would return to normal. Maybe it was just the exhaustion of fighting battles I didn't think I should have to fight with my own son. The schedule was just the beginning. Soon, Marcus began treating the house as if it were already his. He'd invite friends over without asking, hosting poker nights that left the living room reeking of cigar smoke and littered with empty bottles. When I mentioned it, he'd wave dismissively. "Relax, Mom. It's not like you're using the space. Besides, this is basically my house anyway. You always said you were keeping it for us kids." Us kids. His brother Michael lived in Seattle, running a successful architecture firm. His sister Linda was in Boston, a pediatric surgeon. Neither of them treated me like hired help when they visited. Neither of them assumed their inheritance was a foregone conclusion, but Marcus had always been different. The baby of the family, coddled perhaps more than was wise. Robert had worried about it when he was alive. "We're not doing him any favors. Dot," he'd said after bailing Marcus out of yet another failed business venture. "The boy needs to learn consequences." But Robert had died 8 years ago, and I'd continued cushioning Marcus's falls, each time telling myself it would be the last. Now, at 70, I found myself living under what essentially amounted to his rule in my own home. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. I'd spent the morning doing laundry, Marcus's laundry specifically, because he'd informed me his clothes needed proper attention, and he didn't trust the dry cleaner. I was folding his shirts when I heard voices from the living room. "Yeah, it's not much, but it'll do once I renovate," Marcus was saying. "The old lady's got no vision for what this place could be." I peered around the corner to see him giving a tour to a woman I didn't recognize. Young, blonde, wearing the kind of outfit that suggested she had expectations of a lifestyle Marcus couldn't actually afford. "And your mother's okay with the renovations?" the woman asked. Marcus laughed. "She'll be in a home by then. I've already looked into some nice places. Golden Sunset Gardens has an opening next month. Very reasonable rates." The blood drained from my face. A home? He'd been researching. Putting me in a home? "She doesn't need all this space," he continued, gesturing around my living room, the room where I'd hosted 50 years of Christmas mornings, birthday parties, and family gatherings. "Once I move her out, I can really transform this place. Open floor plan, modern kitchen, maybe add a pool out back." I must have made a sound because they both turned. Marcus had the decency to look slightly abashed, but it passed quickly. "Oh, hi, Mom. This is Kayla. Kayla, my mother." Kayla gave me the kind of smile reserved for elderly relatives and small children. "So nice to meet you, Mrs. Hamilton. Marcus has told me so much about you." I doubted that very much. "Charmed, I'm sure," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "Marcus, could I speak with you for a moment?" "Later, Mom. We're heading out." "Oh, and I noticed the guest bathroom could use attention. The mirror has spots." He guided Kayla toward the door, already dismissing me. After they left, I sat in my kitchen, and tried to process what I'd heard. Golden Sunset Gardens. I knew the place. A converted motel on the outskirts of town where elderly people went to wait for the end. Where families deposited inconvenient relatives who'd outlived their usefulness. My hands shook as I made myself a cup of tea. The kitchen schedule caught my eye. Today I was supposed to clean the refrigerator and mop the floors. According to Marcus's timetable, I had approximately 2 hours before I needed to start dinner. He'd taken to critiquing my cooking lately, comparing it unfavorably to restaurants he couldn't afford. I looked around the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals. The worn spot by the stove where I'd stood nursing sick children with soup. The scratch on the counter from when Michael had tried to help cook Thanksgiving dinner at age 10. The window herb garden Robert had installed for my 50th birthday. This wasn't just a house. This was my home, my history, my life's work. And my youngest son was planning to dispose of me like outdated furniture to claim it for himself. That night, as I served dinner, roast chicken with the vegetables Marcus had specified, prepared exactly as he'd instructed, I studied my son across the table. When had he become this person? The entitlement, the casual cruelty, the assumption that I existed solely to serve his needs. Where had it come from? "The chicken's a bit dry," he commented, scrolling through his phone. "And I told you I prefer the green beans crisp, not mushy." "They're steamed exactly 4 minutes, as you requested," I replied quietly. He looked up, irritated. "Well, clearly, that's too long. Make a note for next time." Next time. As if I were a restaurant cook receiving feedback from a dissatisfied customer. "Marcus," I began carefully, "I overheard you talking to your friend today about Golden Sunset Gardens." He didn't even have the grace to look uncomfortable. "Oh, that. Yeah, I've been thinking it might be good for you, Mom. They have activities, medical staff on hand. And let's be honest, this place is getting to be too much for you. I've managed this house for 45 years. That was when you were younger. Look, Mom, I'm trying to think about what's best for everyone. You'll be taken care of, and I'll make sure the house is properly maintained." "Your house, you mean?" He shrugged. "Well, eventually, yeah. We've always known I'd get the house. Mike and Linda have their own places. They don't need it. And my opinion on the matter?" Marcus set down his phone with exaggerated patience. "Mom, be realistic. You're 70 years old. How much longer do you really need a 4-bedroom house? Golden Sunset Gardens is nice. They have bingo nights." Bingo nights. He was reducing my life to bingo nights. I cleared the dishes in silence while Marcus retreated to the living room. As I washed the plates, by hand, because Marcus claimed the dishwasher left spots, I thought about my options. Or rather, the options Marcus assumed I didn't have. What he didn't know, what none of my children knew, was that I was far from the helpless, destitute widow they apparently believed me to be. 40 years of managing Robert's medical practice had taught me about more than just appointment scheduling and insurance billing. I'd watched Robert build his practice from nothing, learned about investments and property management, and quietly built my own portfolio over the decades. The house was in my name alone. Robert had insisted on it. "If anything happens to me," he'd said, "I want to know you're secure." But more than that, I owned 2 rental properties across town, had a substantial investment account, and maintained relationships with lawyers and financial advisors who'd known me for decades. Marcus saw a feeble old woman dependent on his charity. The reality was quite different. Later that evening, as I sat in my bedroom, the one room Marcus hadn't yet claimed authority over, I opened my laptop and began researching, not Golden Sunset Gardens, but real estate lawyers, property management companies, and investment strategies. If Marcus wanted the house so badly, perhaps it was time to give him exactly what he deserved: nothing. The next morning, I woke to find a new addition to my schedule. Marcus had apparently decided the garage needed reorganizing and had allocated me 6 hours for the task. I stared at the laminated sheet, at my name listed next to every demeaning chore, and made my decision. I dressed carefully, not in the housework clothes I'd been wearing lately, but in one of my good suits. The navy one Robert had bought me for our 40th anniversary. I styled my silver hair the way I used to for office meetings and applied lipstick for the first time in months. When I came downstairs, Marcus was at the kitchen table with his laptop, probably researching more ways to monetize my eventual eviction. He glanced up, surprised. Going somewhere? The garage won't clean itself. I have appointments, I said simply, collecting my purse. Appointments? What appointments? And what about my breakfast? I paused at the door. There's cereal in the pantry and eggs in the refrigerator. I'm sure you can manage. His expression shifted from surprise to indignation. Mom, we have a schedule. You can't just... I'm 70 years old, Marcus, not 7. I don't need your permission to leave my own house. Before he could respond, I was out the door, car keys in hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in months, free. My first stop was the law office of Jameson and Associates. Patricia Jameson had handled Robert's estate and had been encouraging me to update my own arrangements for years. She greeted me warmly, though her expression grew concerned as I explained my situation. He's planning to put you in a home against your will, she asked, taking careful notes. He seems to think the decision is already made. He's been showing the house to friends, discussing renovations. Patricia's lips thinned. And he's requiring you to perform household duties on a schedule? I produced the laminated sheet. Patricia studied it with growing disapproval. Dorothy, this borders on elder abuse, financial exploitation, at minimum. You have options here. No, I said quietly. I want to explore all of them. We spent the next 2 hours discussing possibilities. By the time I left, I had a clear plan and several appointments scheduled for the following week. My next stop was Riverside Realty. The agent, Tom Morrison, had sold me my rental properties years ago. He whistled low when I explained what I was considering. Selling the Hamilton place? That's prime real estate, Dorothy. 4 bedrooms, established neighborhood, that beautiful garden you've maintained. In this market, you're looking at significant appreciation since you bought it. What about a quick sale? I asked. Hypothetically speaking, Tom's eyes gleamed with professional interest. For the right price, I could have offers within days. Cash buyers, even. Developers have been circling that neighborhood for years. I nodded, filing the information away. Let me think about it. But if I decide to move forward, how quickly could we proceed? With your documents in order? We could list tomorrow and potentially close within 30 days, maybe faster for cash. Perfect. When I returned home that afternoon, Marcus was in a state. He'd apparently had to make his own lunch, a tragedy of epic proportions, judging by his expression. Where have you been? He demanded. The garage is still a mess. The bathrooms haven't been cleaned. And I had a client call that I nearly missed because I was trying to find something to eat. How unfortunate, I said mildly, hanging up my coat. This is unacceptable, Mom. We have a system. You can't just abandon your responsibilities whenever you feel like it. I turned to face him fully. My responsibilities? Tell me, Marcus, what exactly are your responsibilities in this arrangement? He looked genuinely puzzled. I'm rebuilding my career. I'm planning for our future. Our future? Or your future in my house? His face flushed. That's not fair. I'm trying to take care of you. By researching nursing homes without my knowledge? By treating me as unpaid labor? By showing my home to strangers while discussing renovations you haven't consulted me about? You're overreacting. And you're obviously overwhelmed by the housework, which proves my point about Golden Sunset Gardens. I smiled then, probably the first genuine smile I'd had in months. You're right, Marcus. I am overwhelmed. Clearly, changes need to be made. He relaxed, assuming he'd won. Exactly. I'll call Golden Sunset tomorrow and... That won't be necessary, I interrupted. I'll be making my own arrangements. Over the next week, while maintaining the pretense of following Marcus's schedule, I systematically put my plans in motion. I met with Patricia to update my will, consulted with Tom about listing the house, and quietly began sorting through 45 years of possessions. Marcus, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued treating me like staff. If anything, his behavior worsened. He'd taken to leaving notes critiquing my cleaning performance and had started timing my grocery shopping trips. "Efficiency, Mom," he'd say. "You were gone 2 hours yesterday. That's excessive for a simple shopping trip." I didn't bother explaining that I'd also stopped at the bank to open new accounts in my name alone, or that I'd met with a moving company to get estimates. The turning point came 2 weeks later. I'd spent the morning following Marcus's bathroom cleaning protocol. His latest addition required me to clean the grout with a toothbrush, when I heard him on the phone in his room. "Yeah, Mom's finally coming around to the idea," he was saying. "I figure another month or two and she'll be ready for Golden Sunset. Then I can start the real renovations." A pause, then laughter. "No, she has no idea about the home equity line of credit I'm planning. The house has got to be worth at least $600,000 in this market. Once I get power of attorney, I can leverage that equity for my business ventures. Power of attorney. Home equity line of credit. My blood ran cold. She's getting more compliant every day," he continued. "The cleaning schedule was genius. Keeps her busy and reinforces who's really in charge here. By the time I suggest Golden Sunset again, she'll probably be relieved." I set down my cleaning supplies and walked quietly to my bedroom. Inside my closet, behind a row of winter coats, sat the small safe where I kept important documents. I opened it and removed several folders: property deeds, investment statements, bank accounts. Everything Marcus thought he knew about my situation was wrong. Everything he assumed about my helplessness was a lie he'd told himself to justify his behavior. That afternoon, while Marcus was out with another potential investor, or perhaps showing my house to another girlfriend, I made several phone calls. By evening, everything was in motion. Tom Morrison called the next day while Marcus was in the shower. "Dorothy, I have incredible news. We have 3 cash offers already, all above asking price. How soon can we close? For the highest bidder? 2 weeks if you're willing to expedite. Do it." "And the contents? I'll be taking what I want. Everything else goes with the house or to charity." I had just hung up when Marcus emerged, hair still damp, reaching for the coffee I'd supposedly made incorrectly yesterday. "Mom, I need you to focus on the garage today. I'm having some people over this weekend, and I want to show them the potential for converting it to a home office." "Of course," I agreed peacefully. "Whatever you think is best." He paused, perhaps surprised by my easy acquiescence. Then he shrugged and gathered his things for another business meeting. After he left, I called the moving company, then a real estate agent in Phoenix, where the weather would be kind to my arthritis, and where I'd researched several active senior communities, the kind where residents lived independently in their own condos, not the institutional facilities Marcus had in mind. Over the next 2 weeks, I maintained my facade of compliance while orchestrating my exit. I sorted through possessions, keeping only what truly mattered: photos, Robert's medical bag, my mother's china, a few pieces of furniture with sentimental value. Everything else I either donated or left for the estate sale Tom was organizing. Marcus, supremely confident in his control, noticed nothing. He continued leaving his critical notes, adding to my schedule, treating the house as his future domain. He even brought contractors by one afternoon to discuss removing walls and modernizing the kitchen. "Don't mind Mom," he told them when I served tea. "She won't be here for the renovations." The contractors exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. 3 days before closing, I began my final preparations. While Marcus was out, I moved my selected belongings to a storage unit. I transferred utilities to the new owner's name effective on closing day. I forwarded my mail to a post office box. The night before everything would change, we sat at dinner, Marcus critiquing my pot roast while scrolling through renovation websites on his tablet. I'm thinking marble countertops, he mused. And definitely hardwood throughout. This old carpeting has to go. It sounds expensive, I ventured. He waved dismissively. That's what home equity is for. This place has been sitting here for decades, building value. Time to put it to work. And where will I live during renovations? Mom, we've been through this. Golden Sunset Gardens is perfect for you. I've already put down a deposit for next month. A deposit. With what money? I wondered. His? Or had he somehow accessed mine? I see, I said quietly. You'll thank me eventually, he continued. It's really the best solution for everyone. You'll have care, activities, people your own age, and I'll make sure this place reaches its full potential. That night, I packed my final suitcase. Everything else was already gone or designated for the new owners. In the morning, while Marcus slept late as usual, I would meet Tom at his office for the closing. I looked around the bedroom where Robert and I had spent so many years, where I'd nursed him through his final illness, where I'd grieved his loss, and slowly rebuilt my life. It was time to go. But first, there was one more laminated schedule to prepare. I sat at my computer and created a new document. At the top, Marcus's new household schedule. Wake up and realize the house has been sold 6:15 a.m. Discover all utilities have been transferred 6:30 a.m. Find the note from Mom 7 a.m. Contact lawyer, number provided. 8 a.m. Begin apartment hunting. 9 a.m. Start job searching. Suggest actual paying employment. 10 a.m. Cancel. Golden Sunset Gardens deposit. 11 a.m. Call siblings to explain situation. 12 p.m. Order lunch. No one available to cook. 1 p.m. Continue processing the reality of consequences. 2 p.m. Maybe finally understand that mothers aren't maids. I printed it out, laminated it with Marcus's machine, and placed it on the kitchen table with a simple note. Dear Marcus, the house has been sold. Your belongings are in the garage, which you wanted so badly to renovate. The new owners take possession at noon today. I've taken what's mine, which, as it turns out, was everything. The proceeds from the sale will fund my new life in a community where residents are valued for their wisdom and experience, not their willingness to scrub floors. Your siblings have been informed. Michael offered you his guest room if needed. Linda suggested therapy. I love you, but I will not be treated as hired help by my own son. Perhaps starting over will teach you what I apparently failed to. That respect isn't about age or money, but about recognizing the dignity in every person. Your mother, not your maid, Dorothy P.S. The cleaning supplies are under the sink. You'll need them for your new apartment. The closing was scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning. As I turned off the lights and headed to my bedroom for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation for tomorrow. Marcus thought he'd been planning my future. Instead, he'd inspired me to reclaim it. And sometimes, that's exactly what it takes. Someone mistaking your kindness for weakness, to remind you of your own strength. The maid was retiring, but Dorothy Hamilton was just getting started. The morning of the closing dawned crisp and clear. I'd been awake since 4, not from anxiety but from anticipation, the kind of energy I hadn't felt since Robert's funeral 8 years ago. By 5:30, I was showered, dressed in my best suit, and sitting in my car with the engine running, watching the sun rise over the house where I'd spent the last 45 years. My suitcase was in the trunk. My purse beside me contained all the essential documents, and in the cup holder sat my cell phone, deliberately switched to silent. Marcus wouldn't wake for at least another 2 hours, assuming his typical schedule. By then, I'd be at Tom Morrison's office, signing papers that would irrevocably change both our futures. As I drove through the familiar streets of Ashwood Grove, memories flooded back, not of the recent months of servitude, but of the journey that had brought me to this point. The lessons that had prepared me for this moment hadn't begun with Marcus's laminated schedules or his casual cruelty. They'd started decades earlier, in a small apartment above a hardware store in downtown Cincinnati, where I'd learned that security comes not from what others give you, but from what you build for yourself. I was 22 when I met Robert Hamilton, fresh out of secretarial school with dreams bigger than my typing speed. He was a junior resident at Cincinnati General, all of 28, and convinced he would revolutionize family medicine. I was working as a receptionist in the hospital's administrative offices, filing papers and fetching coffee for men who looked through me as if I were part of the furniture. My childhood hadn't prepared me for much beyond basic survival. My father had left when I was 8, leaving my mother to raise 3 children on a waitress's salary. We'd moved constantly, always one step ahead of eviction notices, living on the economic edge that so many single-parent families know too. Well, never depend on a man for your security, my mother would tell me as she counted her tips at the kitchen table, sorting bills into piles of must pay and can wait. Love them if you want, marry them if you must, but always have something that's yours alone. She'd learned this lesson the hard way. My father had controlled every penny during their marriage, leaving her with nothing when he walked out. Watching her rebuild from nothing, create stability from chaos, taught me about resilience before I even knew the word. Robert was different from the other doctors in training who occasionally noticed the receptionist. He actually looked at me when he spoke, remembered my name, asked about my opinions on things beyond coffee preferences. Our first conversation happened over a jammed copy machine. "Let me guess," he'd said, appearing beside me as I wrestled with the paper tray. They assumed the secretary would magically know how to fix it? Something like that, I'd agreed, frustrated with both the machine and the assumption. He'd knelt beside me, studying the mechanism. My father owns a hardware store, spent summers fixing everything from typewriters to lawnmowers. May I? Within minutes, he had the machine humming again. But instead of leaving with the casual superiority I expected, he stayed. "Dorothy, right? I've seen you in the administrative meetings. You take better notes than the department heads." I'd laughed, surprised. Someone has to pay attention. Half of them are asleep. Is that what you want to do? Take notes of other people's decisions? The question caught me off guard. Most people assumed that was exactly what I wanted. A stable job, steady paycheck, no ambitions beyond marriage, and children. But Robert's tone suggested genuine curiosity, not condescension. "I want to run something," I'd admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. Not just keep someone else's schedule, but actually build something. What kind of something? I'd thought about it during countless hours of filing, maybe a medical practice, but the right kind, where patients are people, not case numbers, where the business side supports the healing instead of driving it. Robert's eyes had lit up. That's exactly what I want to create. A family practice that actually serves families. 6 months later, we were married in a simple ceremony at the courthouse. My mother, worn down by years of struggle, had pulled me aside beforehand. "He seems like a good man," she'd said carefully. "But remember what I taught you. Keep something for yourself, always." I'd promised her I would, though at 22, in love with an idealistic young doctor, I couldn't imagine needing an escape plan. Our early years were lean but purposeful. Robert completed his residency while I worked days at the hospital and nights taking business courses at the community college. We lived in a 1-bedroom apartment near the hospital, saving every penny, toward his dream of opening a practice. "Our practice," he would correct me when I called it his dream. "I'll handle the medicine. You'll handle everything else." Everything else, it turned out, was everything that mattered. While Robert focused on healing, I learned about small business administration, medical billing, insurance negotiations, payroll management, and the 1,000 details that make or break a medical practice. My professors at night school were impressed with my questions, practical, specific, focused on real-world application rather than theory. The turning point came 3 years into our marriage. Robert had been offered a position with an established practice in Ashwood Grove, a growing suburb, 20 miles from Cincinnati. The senior partner, Dr. Kellerman, was nearing retirement and looking for someone to eventually take over. "It's perfect," Robert had said, spreading the contract across our kitchen table. "Good salary, established patient base, buyout option. In 5 years." I'd studied the numbers, running calculations in my head. "We could do better on our own." Robert had blinked, surprised. "Starting from scratch? That's risky, Dot." "Everything worthwhile is risky," I'd countered, pulling out the business plan I'd been developing in my evening classes. "Look at these demographics. Ashwood Grove is growing by 12% annually. Young families, good insurance coverage, limited competition. If we open our own practice now, we'll be established before the big medical groups notice the opportunity." We'd debated for weeks. Robert, for all his idealism, was cautious about financial risk. But I'd inherited my mother's understanding that sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe. "Trust me," I'd finally said. "I've run every scenario. We can make this work." The next morning, I'd walked into Ashwood Grove Savings and Loan with our business plan and loan application. The manager, Mr. Canton, had barely looked at me. "Is your husband coming?" he'd asked, shuffling papers without reading them. "He's seeing patients," I'd replied evenly. "I handle the business side of our partnership." Mr. Canton's skepticism had been palpable. In 1978, banks still regularly refused business loans to women without male co-signers. But I'd come prepared. For 2 hours, I'd walked him through our projections, market analysis, and repayment schedules. I'd anticipated every objection, countered every concern with hard data. "Where did you learn all this?" he'd finally asked, genuinely curious. "Night school, practical experience, and a mother who taught me that women need to be twice as prepared as men to get half the credit." He'd approved the loan. The Hamilton family medical practice opened 6 months later in a converted Victorian house on Maple Street. While Robert focused on building patient relationships, I handled everything else: negotiating supply contracts, managing staff, establishing billing procedures, creating marketing strategies. Our first employee was Nancy Chen, a nurse who'd been passed over for promotion at the hospital because of what her supervisor called language barriers, despite her perfect English and superior qualifications. Our second was Maria Santos, a billing specialist who'd been let go from her previous position when she'd requested maternity leave. "Why do you always hire women with complications?" Robert had asked after I'd brought on Sarah Williams, a single mother who needed flexible hours. "Because they're excellent at their jobs and grateful for the opportunity," I'd replied. "Also because I remember what it's like to be overlooked and undervalued." The practice grew steadily. Within 2 years, we'd hired 2 additional doctors and moved to a larger facility. I'd negotiated the property purchase myself, using the equity from our first building as leverage. The seller had tried to wait for Robert to arrive, clearly uncomfortable dealing with a woman on such a significant transaction. "Mrs. Hamilton, perhaps we should reschedule when your husband can attend," he'd suggested. "Mr. Brennan, I'm the financial officer of our practice. My husband trusts my judgment completely. Now, about the inspection contingencies." He'd never suggested waiting for Robert again. By our 10th anniversary, the Hamilton family medical practice was the largest independent practice in Ashwood Grove. We'd weathered the recession of the early 80s by diversifying our services and maintaining strict financial controls. While other practices had folded or been absorbed by hospital groups, we'd actually expanded. This success wasn't accidental. Every financial decision had been carefully considered, every opportunity evaluated against long-term sustainability rather than short-term gain. I'd established multiple revenue streams: the main practice, a small urgent care clinic, and medical office space that we leased to specialists. "You think like a CEO, not a doctor's wife," our accountant had once told me, intending it as a compliment. I think like a business owner, I'd corrected him. The fact that I'm also a doctor's wife is irrelevant to the balance sheet. The children had arrived in quick succession: Michael in 1982, Linda in 1984, and Marcus in 1987. Each pregnancy had been carefully timed around the practice's needs, each maternity leave structured to minimize disruption. I'd returned to work 6 weeks after each birth, bringing the babies to the office where I'd established a small nursery next to my office. "You can't do everything," Robert had worried, watching me nurse Marcus while reviewing insurance contracts. "Watch. Me?" I'd replied, already planning the practice's next expansion. The juggling act wasn't easy. There were days when I'd wondered if I was failing at everything. Not patient enough with the children, not focused enough on the practice, not present enough for Robert. But my mother's voice would echo in these moments of doubt. "Perfect is the enemy of good enough. Do what needs doing and don't apologize for it." I'd built systems for everything. The household ran on schedules that would have impressed a military commander. The children learned early to be self-sufficient, making their own lunches by age 7, doing their own laundry by 10, not because I was negligent, but because I was teaching them competence. "Why can't you be like other moms?" Linda had complained once, upset that I'd missed a school play due to a practice emergency. "Because other moms don't run medical practices that employ 30 people and serve thousands of patients," I'd explained. "But also because I want you to see that women can be more than what's expected." The financial education started early, too. Each child received an allowance tied to chores, but also instruction in budgeting and saving. By age 12, they each had savings accounts and investment goals. Michael gravitated toward architecture after spending summers at the practice watching our expansion projects. Linda's interest in medicine came from accompanying Robert on rounds during school breaks. Marcus had always been different. The baby of the family, born when I was 35 and perhaps more indulged than his siblings. While Michael and Linda embraced the lessons about work and responsibility, Marcus seemed to absorb a different message: that success was his birthright rather than something to be earned. "He's spoiled," my mother had observed during a visit, when Marcus was 10. "You've worked so hard to give them opportunities you never had, but that boy thinks opportunity is obligation." She'd been right, of course. While Michael and Linda worked part-time jobs through high school and college, Marcus had always had reasons why he couldn't. While his siblings saved and invested, Marcus spent freely, confident that more would always be available. The pattern had concerned Robert. "We're not teaching him the right values," he'd worried after bailing Marcus out of yet another financial scrape in college. "He'll learn," I'd assured him, always making excuses. "He's still young." But youth became young. Adulthood and the lessons never took. Marcus drifted through college, changing majors 3 times before settling on business. Not from passion, but because it seemed easiest. His grades were mediocre, his effort minimal, his expectations enormous. "I don't understand why I have to start at entry level," he'd complained after graduation. "Our family owns a medical practice. I should be in management." "You know nothing about medical practice management," I'd pointed out. "Start at the bottom, learn the business, earn your position." He'd taken this as a personal insult, as if requiring experience was somehow betraying family loyalty. Instead of joining our practice, he'd pursued a series of increasingly speculative business ventures, each funded by loans he'd expected us to cover when they failed. Robert had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2014. The next 18 months had been a blur of treatments, hope, despair, and finally acceptance. I'd managed both the practice and his care, maintaining professional composure during the day while crying in hospital bathrooms at night. "Promise me something," Robert had said during his last week, when we both knew the end was near. Don't. Let the practice become your whole life. And don't let Marcus drain what we've built. I'd promised, though I wasn't sure how to keep either commitment. Robert's death had left a void that work couldn't fill, but work was what I knew. The practice became my refuge, the place where I could function normally while grief consumed my private hours. Our early years were lean but purposeful. Robert completed his residency while I worked days at the hospital and nights taking business courses at the community college. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment near the hospital, saving every penny, toward his dream of opening a practice. Our practice, he would correct me when I called it his dream. I'll handle the medicine. You'll handle everything else. Everything else, it turned out, was everything that mattered. While Robert focused on healing, I learned about small business administration, medical billing, insurance negotiations, payroll management, and the 1,000 details that make or break a medical practice. My professors at night school were impressed with my questions. Practical, specific, focused on real-world application rather than theory. The turning point came 3 years into our marriage. Robert had been offered a position with an established practice in Ashwood Grove, a growing suburb, 20 miles from Cincinnati. The senior partner, Dr. Kellerman, was nearing retirement and looking for someone to eventually take over. "It's perfect," Robert had said, spreading the contract across our kitchen table. "Good salary, established patient base, buyout option, in 5 years." I'd studied the numbers, running calculations in my head. We could do better on our own. Robert had blinked, surprised. Starting from scratch? That's risky, Dot. Everything worthwhile is risky, I'd countered, pulling out the business plan I'd been developing in my evening classes. Look at these demographics. Ashwood Grove is growing by 12% annually. Young families, good insurance coverage, limited competition. If we open our own practice now, we'll be established before the big medical groups notice the opportunity. We'd debated for weeks. Robert, for all his idealism, was cautious about financial risk, but I'd inherited my mother's understanding that sometimes the biggest risk is playing it safe. "Trust me," I'd finally said. "I've run every scenario. We can make this work." The next morning, I'd walked into Ashwood Grove Savings and Loan with our business plan and loan application. The manager, Mr. Canton, had barely looked at me. "Is your husband coming?" he'd asked, shuffling papers without reading them. "He's seeing patients," I'd replied evenly. "I handle the business side of our partnership." Mr. Canton's skepticism had been palpable. In 1978, banks still regularly refused business loans to women without male co-signers. But I'd come prepared. For 2 hours, I'd walked him through our projections, market analysis, and repayment schedules. I'd anticipated every objection, countered every concern with hard data. "Where did you learn all this?" he'd finally asked, genuinely curious. "Night school, practical experience, and a mother who taught me that women need to be twice as prepared as men to get half the credit." He'd approved the loan. The Hamilton family medical practice opened 6 months later in a converted Victorian house on Maple Street. While Robert focused on building patient relationships, I handled everything else: negotiating supply contracts, managing staff, establishing billing procedures, creating marketing strategies. Our first employee was Nancy Chen, a nurse who'd been passed over for promotion at the hospital because of what her supervisor called language barriers, despite her perfect English and superior qualifications. Our second was Maria Santos, a billing specialist who'd been let go from her previous position when she'd requested maternity leave. "Why do you always hire women with complications?" Robert had asked after I'd brought on Sarah Williams, a single mother who needed flexible hours. "Because they're excellent at their jobs and grateful for the opportunity," I'd replied. "Also because I remember what it's like to be overlooked and undervalued." The practice grew steadily. Within 2 years, we'd hired 2 additional doctors and moved to a larger facility. I'd negotiated the property purchase myself, using the equity from our first building as leverage. The seller had tried to wait for Robert to arrive, clearly, uncomfortable dealing with a woman on such a significant transaction. "Mrs. Hamilton, perhaps we should reschedule when your husband can attend?" he'd suggested. "Mr. Brennan, I'm the financial officer of our practice. My husband trusts my judgment completely. Now, about the inspection contingencies, he'd never suggested waiting for Robert again. By our 10th anniversary, the Hamilton family medical practice was the largest independent practice in Ashwood Grove. We'd weathered the recession of the early 80s by diversifying our services and maintaining strict financial controls. While other practices had folded or been absorbed by hospital groups, we'd actually expanded. This success wasn't accidental. Every financial decision had been carefully considered, every opportunity evaluated against long-term sustainability rather than short-term gain. I'd established multiple revenue streams: the main practice, a small urgent care clinic, and medical office space that we leased to specialists. "You think like a CEO, not a doctor's wife," our accountant had once told me, intending it as a compliment. "Think like a business owner," I'd corrected him. The fact that I'm also a doctor's wife is irrelevant to the balance sheet. The children had arrived in quick succession: Michael in 1982, Linda in 1984, and Marcus in 1987. Each pregnancy had been carefully timed around the practice's needs, each maternity leave structured to minimize disruption. I'd returned to work 6 weeks after each birth, bringing the babies to the office where I'd established a small nursery next to my office. "You can't do everything," Robert had worried, watching me nurse Marcus while reviewing insurance contracts. "Watch me," I'd replied, already planning the practice's next expansion. The juggling act wasn't easy. There were days when I'd wondered if I was failing at everything, not patient enough with the children, not focused enough on the practice, not present enough for Robert. But my mother's voice would echo in these moments of doubt. "Perfect is the enemy of good enough. Do what needs doing, and don't apologize for it." I'd built systems for everything. The household ran on schedules that would have impressed a military commander. The children learned early to be self-sufficient, making their own lunches by age 7, doing their own laundry by 10, not because I was negligent, but because I was teaching them competence. "Why can't you be like other moms?" Linda had complained once, upset that I'd missed a school play due to a practice emergency, because other moms don't run medical practices that employ 30 people and serve thousands of patients, I'd explained. But also because I want you to see that women can be more than what's expected. The financial education started early, too. Each child received an allowance tied to chores, but also instruction in budgeting and saving. By age 12, they each had savings accounts and investment goals. Michael gravitated toward architecture after spending summers at the practice watching our expansion projects. Linda's interest in medicine came from accompanying Robert on rounds during school breaks. Marcus had always been different. The baby of the family, born when I was 35 and perhaps more indulged than his siblings. While Michael and Linda embraced the lessons about work and responsibility, Marcus seemed to absorb a different message: that success was his birthright rather than something to be earned. "He's spoiled," my mother had observed during a visit. When Marcus was 10, "You've worked so hard to give them opportunities you never had, but that boy thinks opportunity is obligation." She'd been right, of course. While Michael and Linda worked part-time jobs through high school and college, Marcus had always had reasons why he couldn't. While his siblings saved and invested, Marcus spent freely, confident that more would always be available. The pattern had concerned Robert. "We're not teaching him the right values," he'd worried after bailing Marcus out of yet another financial scrape in college. "He'll learn," I'd assured him, always making excuses. "He's still young." But youth became young. Adulthood and the lessons never took. Marcus drifted through college, changing majors 3 times before settling on business. Not from passion, but because it seemed easiest. His grades were mediocre, his effort minimal, his expectations enormous. "I don't understand why I have to start at entry level," he'd complained after graduation. "Our family owns a medical practice. I should be in management." "You know nothing about medical practice management," I'd pointed out. "Start at the bottom, learn the business, earn your position." He'd taken this as a personal insult, as if requiring experience was somehow betraying family loyalty. Instead of joining our practice, he'd pursued a series of increasingly speculative business ventures, each funded by loans he'd expected us to cover when they failed. Robert had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2014. The next 18 months had been a blur of treatments, hope, despair, and finally acceptance. I'd managed both the practice and his care, maintaining professional composure during the day while crying in hospital bathrooms at night. "Promise me something," Robert had said during his last week, when we both knew the end was near. "Don't let the practice become your whole life. And don't let Marcus drain what we've built." I'd promised, though I wasn't sure how to keep either commitment. Robert's death had left a void that work couldn't fill, but work was what I knew. The practice became my refuge, the place where I could function normally while grief consumed my private hours. Michael and Linda had been rocks during this time, flying in regularly, handling arrangements, supporting both me and the practice. Marcus had been notably absent, claiming work obligations that we all knew were fictional. He'd appeared for the funeral, complained about his inheritance share, and disappeared again within days. He's hurting too. I'd defended him to his siblings. "Everyone grieves differently." "He's not grieving, Mom," Linda had said gently. "He's calculating." She'd been right about that too. Within months of Robert's death, Marcus had started hinting about his share of the estate. Never mind that Robert and I had built everything together, that my name was on every document, that I was very much alive and still running the practice. In Marcus's mind, his father's death meant immediate windfall. I'd started making changes after Robert's death. Sold my shares in the practice to the younger partners we'd brought in, keeping only a consulting role. Liquidated some assets and diversified into real estate and conservative investments. The financial advisors had been impressed with my portfolio knowledge, not realizing I'd been managing investments alongside the practice for decades. "You have significant wealth here, Mrs. Hamilton," one advisor had noted. "More than enough for a very comfortable retirement. Have you considered your estate planning?" I'd already updated everything. Michael and Linda were established in their careers, financially independent, living their own lives. They would receive their inheritance eventually, but they didn't need it. Marcus was another story. His financial irresponsibility had only worsened with age, each failed venture blamed on circumstances rather than choices. The decision to maintain the appearance of modest means had been deliberate. I'd watched too many families destroyed by premature inheritance, seen too many children ruined by unearned wealth. My mother's lessons about keeping something for yourself had evolved into keeping everything to yourself until the time was right. The house in Ashwood Grove, purchased during our practice's early years, had appreciated enormously, but I'd maintained it simply, refusing the renovations and updates that would have signaled wealth. My car was reliable but unremarkable. My clothes were quality but not designer. To outside observers, including my children, I appeared to be a comfortable widow living on a pension and the proceeds from selling her husband's practice. The reality was far different. Between the real estate holdings, investment accounts, and business interests, I had accumulated wealth that would have stunned my children. Not millions plural, but enough to live lavishly if I'd chosen. Instead, I'd continued the patterns of careful management that had built this security. Marcus's return home after his third divorce had initially seemed like an opportunity. Perhaps I'd thought. This crisis would finally teach him the responsibility he'd avoided for so long. I'd welcomed him back, hoping that proximity might rebuild our relationship, that he might finally see me as more than a source of funds. Instead, he'd seen an opportunity of a different kind. The lonely widow, the big empty house, the assumed helplessness of age, all of it had crystallized in his mind as a situation to be exploited rather than a relationship to be cherished. The cleaning schedule had been the final insult. Not just the tasks themselves, but the assumption behind them, that I existed to serve his needs, that my lifetime of achievement could be reduced to domestic labor, that age automatically meant subservience. As I pulled into the parking lot of Morrison Realty, I thought about my mother's reaction if she could have seen those laminated sheets. She would have laughed, probably, then told me I'd waited too long to teach that boy proper lessons. She'd have been right about that, too. The building was just opening as I arrived. Tom Morrison met me at the door, looking slightly concerned. About the early hour, but too professional to comment. His assistant had coffee ready, the conference room prepared with all the necessary documents. "The buyers are eager to close," Tom informed me as we settled in. "They've already scheduled contractors to begin renovations next week. I hope that's not too fast for you." "Not at all," I assured him. "The faster, the better." As I signed my name to document after document, I thought about all the papers I'd signed over the years. Business loans, property deeds, employee contracts, insurance policies. Thousands of decisions that had built the security Marcus assumed he could claim without effort. "That's the last one," Tom announced finally. "Congratulations, Dorothy. Or should I say, congratulations on your new beginning." "Both," I said, accepting the check that represented 45 years of memories converted to cash. "Definitely both." My phone, still on silent, showed 17 missed calls from Marcus. He would have found my note by now, discovered the reality of his situation. I felt a twinge of maternal guilt, quickly suppressed. Sometimes the kindest thing a parent can do is allow their child to experience consequences. The drive to Phoenix would take 2 days. I'd mapped out the route carefully, planning stops in towns I'd always wanted to visit but never had time for. The senior community I'd chosen, Desert Willow Active Living, was nothing like the institutional facility Marcus had selected for me. Individually owned condos, community amenities, social activities chosen rather than mandated. Most importantly, a place where residents were valued for their experience rather than dismissed for their age. As I merged onto the interstate, heading west toward a future I'd chosen rather than one chosen for me, I thought about the lessons that had brought me here. My mother's fierce independence, developed from necessity but maintained by choice. Robert's trust in my capabilities, never questioning my business decisions despite societal assumptions. The practice we'd built together, proof that partnership meant equal contribution, not predetermined roles. And Marcus? Perhaps he would learn from this experience, though I suspected he would simply find another narrative that cast him as victim, rather than architect of his own situation. The difference now was that his education would no longer come at my expense. The Ohio landscape rolled past as I drove, farmland giving way to suburbs, suburbs to farmland again. Somewhere behind me, Marcus was discovering that consequences, unlike mothers, couldn't be scheduled or controlled. Somewhere ahead, a new life waited. One where my worth wasn't measured in cleaning tasks completed, but in wisdom accumulated, experiences shared, and dignity maintained. My phone buzzed again. Without looking, I knew it was Marcus. Later, perhaps. Tomorrow, I would listen to his messages. For now, I had miles to cover and freedoms to explore. The maid had left the building. Dorothy Hamilton was finally coming home to herself. As the miles accumulated and the landscape changed, I found myself thinking about the other women I'd known who'd faced similar crossroads. Nancy Chen, our first nurse, who'd started her own healthcare staffing agency after years of watching hospitals undervalue immigrant professionals. Maria Santos, who'd used her billing expertise to establish a consulting firm helping small medical practices navigate insurance complexities. Sarah Williams, the single mother who'd needed flexible hours and had eventually become our practice administrator, then gone on to earn her healthcare MBA. All of us had started from positions of perceived weakness, women in a male-dominated field, mothers juggling competing demands, individuals whose worth was measured by their utility to others rather than their inherent capabilities. All of us had found ways to transform those limitations into launching pads for something greater. The afternoon sun slanted through the windshield as I crossed into Indiana. I'd planned to stop in Indianapolis for the night, but I felt energized, rather than tired. The future pulled me forward with a magnetic force I hadn't felt in years, not since those early days of building the practice, when every decision held promise and every risk felt worthwhile. My phone had finally stopped buzzing. Marcus had either given up or his phone had died. He was notorious for forgetting to charge it, another small responsibility he'd considered beneath his attention. I wondered if he'd called his siblings yet, how he'd frame the story to them. Michael and Linda would see through whatever narrative he constructed, but they'd also feel obligated to help. Not financially, I'd raised them better than that, but emotionally, offering support he'd interpret as validation. That was fine. Family was complex, and sibling bonds operated by different rules than parent-child relationships. They could maintain their connections without requiring my participation in Marcus's ongoing drama. The real test would come later, when the immediate crisis passed, and Marcus had to build something from nothing. The way his grandmother had, the way I had, the way most people did when life demanded reinvention. Would he finally understand that security wasn't inherited, but constructed? That respect wasn't owed, but earned? That mothers were people with their own dreams, not just supporting characters in their children's stories? Time would tell. But that telling would happen without me as witness or participant. I'd given him 45 years of chances to see me as I actually was. Now he'd have to figure out who he was without the safety net he'd taken for granted. The highway stretched ahead, an arrow pointing toward possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. Behind me, a house stood empty, waiting for new owners who would create their own memories within its walls. And somewhere in that empty house, a laminated schedule lay on a kitchen table. Not an ending, but finally, impossibly, a beginning. For both of us. 3 days into my journey west, I sat in a small cafe in Amarillo, Texas, watching tumbleweeds roll past the window and marveling at how different the landscape was from Ohio's gentle hills. My phone, now permanently on silent, showed 47 missed calls from Marcus, 12 from Michael, 8 from Linda, and 1 from Patricia Jameson, my attorney. I'd deal with them all eventually, but for now, I was savoring something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. The waitress, a woman about my age named Dolores, refilled my coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for decades. "Long way from home?" she asked, noting my Ohio plates through the window. "Getting longer every mile," I replied with a smile. "Running to or from?" "Both," I admitted. "Sometimes they're the same thing." She nodded knowingly. "Did that myself 30? Years ago. Best decision I ever made. You traveling alone?" "Just me and my secrets," I said, then caught myself. It was an odd thing to say to a stranger, but something about the desert air and the distance from home made me feel unexpectedly candid. Dolores laughed. "Honey, at our age, secrets are just about the only thing nobody can take from us. You hold on to yours till you're good and ready to let them go." She moved on to other customers, leaving me to contemplate the weight of secrets I'd carried for so long. The funny thing about wealth, real wealth, not just comfortable middle-class stability, was how isolating it could be when you couldn't share it. For 25 years, I'd carefully concealed the extent of my assets, even from my own children, especially from Marcus. The accumulation had been gradual, almost accidental at first. While Robert and I had built the medical practice together, I'd quietly developed my own investment strategy on the side. It had started small, a few $100s here and there in dividend-paying stocks, carefully researched and purchased with money saved from the household budget. Robert had known about some of it, of course. We'd discussed major investment decisions together, planned for retirement, established college funds for the children, but he'd never known the full extent of my parallel portfolio, the separate accounts I'd established using my maiden name, the real estate investments I'd made through carefully structured LLCs. It wasn't deception exactly, more like compartmentalization. A habit learned from my mother, reinforced by years of watching how money changed relationships, how knowledge of wealth altered people's behavior in subtle but profound ways. The first significant windfall had come in 1995, when a small technology stock I'd purchased for $500 had split multiple times before being acquired by Microsoft. That original investment had turned into $230,000, more than our house was worth at the time. I'd reinvested it all, spreading it across blue-chip stocks and emerging markets, letting compound interest work its quiet magic. The real estate investments had begun after that. Small at first, a duplex near the university that I'd rented to graduate students, a strip mall anchor spot that had been undervalued due to temporary vacancy. I'd learned to read market trends, identify undervalued properties, negotiate from a position of patient strength. By 2000, my hidden portfolio was worth over $1 million. By 2010, it had tripled. The financial crisis of 2008, which had devastated so many, had actually accelerated my wealth accumulation. While others panicked and sold at losses, I'd had the liquidity to buy quality assets at discount prices. Warren Buffett's advice about being greedy when others were fearful had proven remarkably accurate. Robert's death had triggered my decision to consolidate and simplify. I'd sold the medical practice shares to our partners, yes, but for far more than anyone realized. The public story was a comfortable buyout that would supplement my pension. The reality was a 7-figure transaction that I'd immediately diversified into tax-advantaged instruments. Then there were the patents. Over the years, I'd quietly invested in medical device startups, using my knowledge from the practice to identify promising technologies. 3 of those investments had resulted in patents that now generated substantial royalty income. The money flowed through a maze of legal structures that would have impressed a Wall Street lawyer, all perfectly legitimate, all completely private. My current net worth, calculated just before leaving Ohio, stood at $8.7 million. Not enough to buy a sports team or a private jet, but more than sufficient to live luxuriously for multiple lifetimes. Enough to solve Marcus's financial problems 100 times over. Enough to have prevented his need to treat me as domestic, help in exchange for housing, but that was precisely why I'd never told him. My phone buzzed. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the screen. A text from Linda. "Mom, please call. Michael and I are worried. Marcus is, well, Marcus. But we need to know you're safe," I typed back. "I'm fine, in Texas. We'll call soon." Her response was immediate. "Texas? Mom, what's going on?" I smiled and put the phone away. Let them wonder a little longer. After months of being treated as predictable, controllable, essentially invisible, a little mystery felt appropriate. That evening, I checked into a boutique hotel in Santa Fe, splurging on a suite with a view of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could have been staying in luxury hotels for years, but had maintained my modest lifestyle partly out of habit, partly out of strategy. The longer people believed you had limited resources, the more their true character revealed itself. I ordered room service, green chili stew and a glass of excellent Malbec, and finally turned my attention to the missed calls. Most of Marcus's messages were predictable: anger, disbelief, accusations of mental instability, demands for explanation. but the most recent one made me sit up straighter. Mom, I know you have money. I found the safety deposit box key and went to the bank. They wouldn't let me access it without you. But I know you're hiding something. We need to talk about this rationally. You can't just disappear with family assets. Family assets. As if my 40 years of careful accumulation automatically belonged to him. As if the money I'd earned, saved, and invested while he was failing at one venture after another was somehow communal property. I called Patricia Jameson. Dorothy, thank goodness. Your son has been making quite a scene at various financial institutions around town. Has he actually accessed anything? Absolutely not. Your security protocols are airtight. He's discovered the existence of some accounts but has no access without your explicit authorization. However, he's threatening legal action. Something about elder abuse and undue influence. I laughed. Actually laughed. He's claiming I'm abusing myself? He's suggesting someone has manipulated you into selling the house and hiding assets. He's particularly fixated on the idea that you must have a boyfriend who's taking advantage of you. A boyfriend? I was genuinely amused now. At 70? Who's supposedly seduced me into financial independence? The theory seems to change hourly. This morning it was a con artist from the internet. This afternoon he was convinced one of your fellow residents at that facility had masterminded an elaborate scheme. Harriet will be delighted to hear she's been promoted to criminal mastermind, I said, thinking of my book club friend at Peaceful Pines. What's our legal exposure? 0, Patricia assured me. You're clearly competent. All transactions are documented, and frankly, his own behavior undermines any claim of your incapacity. I've had 3 bank managers call to complain about his aggressive demands and thinly veiled threats. He's actually making our case for us. Keep documenting everything, I instructed, and prepare a formal cease and desist letter if he continues harassing financial institutions. After ending the call, I sat on my hotel balcony, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. The secret was out, or at least part of it. Marcus knew I had money. He just had no idea how much or how long I'd had it, or what it meant that I'd chosen to live modestly while he assumed I was dependent on his charity. The next morning, I made 2 decisions. First, I would accelerate my timeline for arriving in Phoenix. Second, I would finally have the conversation with Michael and Linda that I'd postponed for too long. They deserved to know the truth, even if Marcus's behavior had forced my hand. I called Michael first. He answered on the second ring, his voice carefully neutral. Mom, Linda said you're in Texas? New Mexico now, I corrected. I'm driving to Phoenix. I've bought a condo there. Silence. Then, you bought a condo? Mom, Marcus says you're having some kind of breakdown. He says you sold the house and disappeared with money that belongs to the family. The house was mine to sell, I said evenly, and the only breakdown I've had was finally breaking free of your brother's assumptions about my life. He showed us the cleaning schedule, Michael said quietly. Linda and I had no idea things had gotten that bad. Why didn't you tell us? The hurt in his voice was genuine. My older children had their own lives, their own responsibilities, but they would have intervened if they'd known how Marcus was treating me. Pride, partly, I admitted. And partly because I wanted to handle it myself. Michael, there are things about my financial situation that I've never shared with any of you. Good reasons for that. But it's time you knew the truth. I gave him an abbreviated version, not specific numbers, but enough to understand that I was financially independent far beyond what they'd assumed. His silence stretched so long, I wondered if we'd been disconnected. How long? He finally asked. How long have you been wealthy? Decades, I admitted. Since before your father died. Separate from the practice, separate from what you knew about. But you lived so simply. Drove that old car. Never traveled. Never spent money on yourself. I spent money on what mattered to me, I corrected. Security, independence, the ability to choose my own path when the time came. That time is now. We talked for another hour. The hurt feelings, the sense of exclusion, the questions about why I'd felt the need for such secrecy. I answered as honestly as I could, watching the New Mexico morning brighten outside my window. Linda's call came immediately after. She'd apparently been waiting for Michael to finish, probably texting with him throughout our conversation. Her reaction was different, less hurt, more analytical. "It makes sense," she said after I'd explained. "The way you always negotiated, always had perfect credit, never worried about money even when the practice had lean years. I should have realized. You were living your own life," I said. "As you should have been." "So what happens now? With Marcus, I mean. He's called me 6 times this morning, each version of the story more dramatic than the last. Currently, I believe, you've been kidnapped by a cult that specializes in elderly widows. A cult that helps elderly widows buy real estate and invest wisely?" "The details are fuzzy," Linda admitted. "But he's convinced you're not acting of your own free will. He can't conceive of a world where you've simply decided you've had enough of his treatment." "And what do you think?" Linda's pause was shorter than Michael's had been. "I think my mother finally remembered she's Dorothy Hamilton, not Marcus's personal maid. And I think it's about damn time." The relief I felt was almost physical. My 2 older children might not understand all my choices, but they supported my right to make them. That was all I'd hoped for. "What should we tell Marcus?" Linda asked. "The truth," I said. "That I'm fine, that I'm starting a new life, and that he needs to start figuring out his own. The Bank of Mom is permanently closed. He won't accept that easily." "No," I agreed. "He won't, but that's no longer my problem to solve." After the calls, I continued my drive west, feeling lighter with each mile. The secret was partly out now, the elaborate architecture of privacy I'd maintained for decades beginning to crumble. But instead of vulnerability, I felt liberation. No more pretending to be poorer than I was, no more allowing assumptions about my dependence, no more subsidizing Marcus's failures while he treated me like hired help. My phone rang. Marcus again. This time, I answered, "Where the hell are you?" No greeting, no concern, just anger. "Driving," I said simply. "I know about the money, Mom. All of it. The accounts, the investments, the properties. Did you think you could hide it forever?" "I wasn't hiding anything," I said. "I was managing my own assets privately, as is my right." "Your assets? That money belongs to the family. Dad would have wanted—" "Your father knew I had independent investments," I interrupted. "He respected my financial autonomy, and he would have been appalled by how you've treated me these past months." "I gave you a place to live. You gave me a cleaning schedule," I corrected, "in my own home, while planning to put me in a cut-rate facility so you could renovate my house for your own use." "That's not— I was trying to help you." "No, Marcus. You were trying to help yourself to what you assumed was your inheritance. Well, surprise. The inheritance comes when I die, not when you decide you need it. This is insane. You can't just leave. You have responsibilities." "To whom? To you? The son who laminated my servitude and posted it on the refrigerator? The son who showed my home to girlfriends while discussing my disposal?" "That son?" His silence was telling. For perhaps the first time, he was hearing his behavior described plainly, without the softening lens of maternal forgiveness. "I'm driving to Phoenix," I continued. "I've bought a condo in a senior community, a nice one, with amenities and activities and respect for its residents. I'll be living my life on my terms, with my own money, making my own choices. Mom, be reasonable. You're 70 years old. You can't just start over." "Watch me," I said, and hung up. The road stretched ahead, straight and empty and full of possibility. Behind me, a son was learning that consequences couldn't be negotiated, that respect couldn't be scheduled, and that mothers were people with their own dreams, not just supporting characters in their children's dramas. The secret of my wealth had been revealed, but the greater secret, the one Marcus might never understand, was that the money had never been the source of my power. It had always been my willingness to walk away from anyone who confused kindness with weakness, who mistook quiet accumulation for absence of ambition. I turned the radio up, a classic rock station playing songs from my youth, and pressed harder, on the accelerator. Phoenix was still a day away, but I was already home. Home in my own skin, home in my own choices, home in the freedom that came from finally, fully, owning my own worth. The weight of secrets I'd carried for so long was transforming into something else, wings. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was ready to fly. That night in Albuquerque, I treated myself to dinner at a renowned restaurant I'd read about for years but never visited. The irony of my former frugality struck me as, I perused the wine list. I could have dined like this every night for decades without denting my principle. Instead, I'd eaten Marcus's critiqued pot roasts and accepted his complaints about my cooking while sitting on millions in assets. The waiter, a young man with an earnest smile, recommended the chef's tasting menu. It's quite an experience, he assured me. 7 courses, each paired with regional wines. Perfect, I said, settling into my chair. I'm celebrating. Special occasion? You could say that. I'm finally spending my own money without apology. He looked slightly confused, but pleased. As the courses arrived, each more elaborate than the last, I found myself thinking about all the small economies I'd practiced over the years. Shopping sales for clothes I could have bought at full price 1,000 times over. Clipping coupons, while million-dollar investments matured in accounts my children never knew existed. Driving a 10-year-old Honda while my real estate portfolio appreciated enough to buy a fleet of luxury cars. Some of it had been habit, learned from my mother and reinforced by early years of genuine scarcity. But most had been strategic, a deliberately maintained facade that allowed me to observe how people treated those they perceived as having limited resources. Marcus had failed that test spectacularly. But then, he'd been failing tests of character for most of his adult life. I'd just been too willing to grade on a curve, to make excuses, to provide safety nets that prevented him from experiencing the natural consequences of his choices. The wine was excellent, each pairing thoughtfully selected to enhance the courses. By the 4th glass, I was feeling philosophical and slightly melancholy. Not regret, I was past that, but a kind of wistful acknowledgement of what might have been. If I'd been more honest about my wealth earlier, would Marcus have developed differently? Or would he simply have felt entitled to more sooner? My phone buzzed. A text from Harriet at Peaceful Pines. Book club voted unanimously. You win this month's Best Exit Strategy Award. Also, your son called here looking for you. I told him you'd joined a motorcycle gang. He actually believed me for a minute. I laughed out loud, startling the waiter who was approaching with the dessert course. Good news? He asked. The best, I assured him. My friends are covering for my prison break. He didn't ask for clarification, probably accustomed to eccentric diners with cryptic celebrations. The dessert was a work of art. Spun sugar and chocolate, berries, and cream arranged like a small architectural marvel. I photographed it, then ate every bite. No guilt about calories, no internal voice calculating the cost. Just pure enjoyment of something beautiful and fleeting. Tomorrow I would reach Phoenix. Tomorrow I would begin the process of setting up my new life. Bank accounts without family signatures, doctors who didn't know my history, neighbors who would meet Dorothy Hamilton as she truly was, not as others had defined her. But tonight, I was suspended between past and future, floating in a present made possible by 40 years of quiet accumulation and one moment of decisive action. The secret of my wealth wasn't a secret anymore, at least not to my children. What remained secret, what might always remain secret from Marcus, was how long I'd been waiting for him to see me as a person rather than a resource. The check arrived in a leather folder, $340 for one meal. I added, a 40% tip and signed with a flourish. The young waiter's eyes widened when he saw the amount. Thank you so much, ma'am. This is very generous. I've recently discovered the pleasure of spending what's mine, I told him. Enjoy it. And remember, your worth isn't determined by what others think you can afford. He nodded, clearly puzzled, but grateful. As I walked back to my hotel through Albuquerque's old town, past galleries and adobe buildings glowing in the evening light, I felt the last chains of my self-imposed limitations falling away. The secret keeper was becoming the truth teller. The accumulated wealth was transforming from hidden burden to liberating force. And somewhere in Ohio, a son was discovering that the maid he'd taken for granted was actually the queen of her own, carefully constructed kingdom. A kingdom he'd never inherit through assumption or manipulation, but might, just might, be welcomed to visit if he learned the price of admission. Respect. But that was tomorrow's challenge, or next month's, or next year's. Tonight, I was Dorothy Hamilton, wealthy woman, free spirit, keeper of her own secrets, and maker of her own choices. And that, as it turned out, was worth more than all the money hidden in all the accounts that Marcus was desperately trying to access. The secret wasn't the wealth. The secret was knowing when to reveal it, and to whom, and why. And most importantly, knowing when to stop caring whether anyone believed it or not. Tomorrow, Phoenix. Tonight, freedom. The rest would sort itself out in time. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my Phoenix condo, watching the sunrise paint the McDowell Mountains in shades of coral and gold. The morning air carried the scent of orange blossoms from the courtyard below, where my neighbor Helen was already tending the community garden. We'd planted tomatoes together last month, heritage varieties that reminded me of my grandmother's garden in Ohio, though these thrived in the desert heat rather than Midwest humidity. My phone sat silent on the patio table beside my coffee. Not because I'd muted it, I no longer felt the need to hide from calls, but because the frantic barrage of messages had finally stopped. It had taken Marcus 4 months to accept what my lawyers called the new reality. 4 months of threats, pleading, manipulation, and finally, reluctantly, acceptance. "Morning, Dorothy," Helen called up. "The Brandywines are coming along beautifully. Want to help me stake them later?" "I'd love to," I replied, genuinely meaning it. This was the life I'd imagined during those long days of scrubbing Marcus's bathroom. Not luxury or idleness, but simple pleasures chosen freely rather than obligations imposed by others. Inside, my condo was a study in intentional living. Not the cluttered accumulation of 45 years in one house, but carefully selected pieces that brought joy or served purpose. The wall of built-in bookshelves held volumes I'd actually read and wanted to read again. The kitchen, compact but efficient, contained only appliances I used regularly. And in the corner of the living room sat my one indulgence, a Steinway baby grand piano, something I'd dreamed of owning since childhood but never permitted myself until now. The doorbell chimed. I glanced at the security monitor, a habit that would probably never fully fade, and saw a familiar face that made my heart simultaneously lift and tighten. Linda stood outside, carrying what looked like a bakery box. "Mom," she said when I opened the door, "I brought eclairs from that place you mentioned on our call, the French bakery on Central." "You didn't have to drive all the way from Boston for pastries," I said. But I was already stepping aside to let her in. "I had a conference in Scottsdale," she admitted, settling the box on my kitchen counter. "But I added an extra day. I wanted to see your new life without distractions." We both knew the distraction she meant. Marcus hadn't been invited to visit, though I'd extended cautious invitations to both Linda and Michael. This was Linda's second trip. Michael had come once, bringing his wife and teenagers, who'd been delighted by the resort-style pool and surprisingly good pizza in downtown Phoenix. Coffee? I offered, already knowing the answer. Linda had inherited my coffee addiction along with my stubborn streak. As I prepared our drinks, she wandered through the condo, taking in the changes since her last visit. "You've added more plants," she observed. "And Mom, is that a telescope on the balcony?" "The night sky here is amazing," I explained. "I've been taking an astronomy class at the community center. Did you know I can see Saturn's rings with that scope?" Linda's expression was hard to read. For months after my dramatic exit from Ohio, both she and Michael had struggled to reconcile the mother they thought they knew with the woman who'd emerged from Marcus's shadow. The adjustment hadn't been entirely smooth. "I've been thinking," Linda said carefully, accepting her coffee. "About secrets, about the ones we keep and the ones we inherit." I waited, recognizing the tone. Linda processed emotions like she processed medical diagnoses, methodically, thoroughly, sometimes painfully. "I understand why you hid the money," she continued, "especially from Marcus, but Michael and we've been talking. We can't help feeling like you didn't trust us either." "It wasn't about trust," I said, though even to my ears, the explanation sounded incomplete. "It was about protection. Yours as much as mine. Protection from what? From making different choices? From maybe not working so hard if we'd known there was a safety net?" The question stung because it held truth. "Perhaps," I admitted, "but also protection from the way money changes relationships. Look at Marcus." "Marcus was Marcus long before he knew about the money," Linda interrupted. "His problems aren't about your wealth, Mom. They're about his character. And maybe they're about the way he was raised differently than Michael and me." This was territory we'd skirted before, but never fully explored. The uncomfortable truth that Marcus had been parented differently, not just because he was youngest, but because by then, Robert and I were more established, more comfortable, more likely to solve problems with checkbooks than life lessons. "You're right," I conceded. "We made mistakes with Marcus. I made mistakes. But keeping the money secret from all of you, that wasn't about him. It was about maintaining my independence, my ability to make choices without committee decisions. Or family conferences." Linda sipped her coffee, processing this. "Like the choice to leave when he tried to put you in that home?" "Exactly like that." We sat in silence for a moment, the morning light streaming through the windows. Below, I could hear the pool maintenance crew beginning their daily routine, the soft splash of water and distant conversation in Spanish. "He's doing better," Linda said eventually. "Marcus, I mean. The business is actually gaining clients. Not the grand empire he always envisioned, but real, paying customers." I'd been receiving updates through Michael, who'd taken on the role of family diplomat. Marcus's consulting firm, focused on helping small businesses navigate financial transitions, had grown slowly but steadily. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that his own financial crisis had finally given him genuine expertise to offer others. "And the house?" I asked. "He's renting a 2-bedroom apartment in Worthington. Nothing fancy, but clean and affordable. He's learning to cook, apparently. Diane gave him some basic recipes." This surprised me. "He's still in touch with Diane?" "They're actually dating again. Cautiously. She says he's different now, more grounded, less entitled, though she's maintaining her own place this time. Another surprise. I'd assumed Marcus's third marriage was permanently over, another casualty of his perpetual adolescence. But perhaps there was hope for growth after all. "And my name?" I asked. "Does he still curse it daily?" Linda laughed, the tension finally breaking. "Weekly, maybe. But it's evolved from anger to something more like bewildered respect." He told Michael last week that he'd never realized you were actually kind of badass. High praise from Marcus, I said dryly. He wants to visit, Linda said carefully. Not yet. He knows he's not ready. But eventually. He's seeing a therapist, working through what he calls toxic entitlement issues. His words, not mine. I considered this. 6 months ago, I would have said never. The humiliation of those laminated schedules, the casual cruelty of planning my institutionalization while I scrubbed his floors. The wounds were still fresh. But time and distance had begun their healing work. Maybe, I said finally. Someday, when he can see me as Dorothy Hamilton, not as his personal staff or his piggy bank. Linda nodded, understanding this was significant progress. Fair enough. Now, show me this garden Helen keeps raving about, and then I want to hear about the astronomy class and the book club and the piano lessons you mentioned. We spent the morning touring my new life, the community garden, where residents grew everything from herbs to heirloom vegetables. The recreation center, where I'd joined a surprisingly competitive pickleball league. The music room, where I was finally learning to play the piano I'd always wanted. You're happy, Linda observed as we sat by the pool, watching residents participate in a water aerobics class. I'm free, I corrected. Happiness is a byproduct of that. That afternoon, as Linda prepared to leave for her conference, she hugged me longer than usual. I'm glad you escaped, Mom. I'm sorry it took such drastic measures, but I'm glad you're here, living this life you built for yourself. After she left, I returned to my balcony, settling into my reading chair with a book from my contemporary fiction club. Harriet had been right. No more romance novels dictated by activities directors. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen. Dinner at the clubhouse tonight? They're serving paella. I smiled and typed back, sounds perfect. As the afternoon heat built, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The years of careful accumulation, both of wealth and grievances. The moment of breaking when I'd realized my own son saw me as nothing more than free labor. The dramatic exit that had shocked everyone, including myself. But mostly, I thought about the present. The freedom to choose my daily activities without consulting laminated schedules, the dignity of being valued for my experience and wisdom rather than my willingness to clean. The simple pleasure of spending money I'd earned without justifying it to anyone. The doorbell chimed again. This time, the security monitor showed a delivery driver with a small package. I signed for it, curious. I hadn't ordered anything recently. Inside was a hand-carved wooden box, similar to ones I'd seen at a craft fair Michael had mentioned visiting with his family. The card read, Mom, I saw this and thought of you. The Kiao artist said it's called a memory box, for keeping treasures. I know you're building new memories now, but maybe there's room for some old ones too. Love, Michael. I opened the box. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay a small brass key. I recognized it immediately. The key to my mother's safety deposit box, the one she'd pressed into my hand on her deathbed. For your independence, she'd whispered. Michael must have found it while helping clear out the Ohio house. He'd understood its significance without needing explanation. That evening at dinner, surrounded by new friends who knew me only as Dorothy, not as someone's mother, widow, or employee, I felt the final pieces of my new life clicking into place. Helen regaled us with stories of her own late-life reinvention after divorce. Tom and Barbara, former teachers from Minnesota, debated the merits of different hiking trails. Susan, a retired CEO, planned our next book club selection. You've been quiet, Dorothy, Helen observed. Good thoughts or bad? Just thinking about independence, I said. How it's not just about money or living alone. It's about having the freedom to define yourself instead of letting others do it for you. Amen to that. Susan raised her wine glass. To late life self-definition. We toasted, and I felt the warmth of belonging without dependence, community without obligation. This was what I'd been seeking. Not isolation, but connection on my own terms. Later that night, I sat at my new piano, fumbling through a simple Mozart sonata. My teacher, a patient woman named Elena, had assured me that 70 wasn't too late to start. Music doesn't care about your age, she'd said, only about your willingness to practice. As I played, hitting wrong notes but improving, with each attempt I thought about Marcus. Somewhere in Ohio, he was perhaps washing his own dishes, paying his own rent, building his own life without the safety net of assumed inheritance. The cruelty with which he'd treated me still stung, might always sting. But I could recognize, now that it had been the catalyst for a transformation we'd both needed, he'd seen me as something to use and discard. In response, I'd shown all of them, who I really was. Not just a secret millionaire, but a woman who refused to accept a valuation based on her utility to others. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was Ohio. I almost let it go to voicemail, then curiosity won. The voice was different, smaller, uncertain. "Hi, Mom. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. Linda said you might not be ready, but I wanted you to know, I get it now. Not everything. I probably never will. But enough. I get why you left." I stayed silent, letting him continue. "I found one of your old notebooks while cleaning out my apartment. Financial records from when I was in high school. You were already managing investments worth more than our house. And you still drove that old Honda, still clipped coupons, still worked full-time. You could have lived completely differently." "Yes," I said simply. "I could have. But you didn't. Because the money wasn't the point. The independence was." Something in my chest loosened slightly. "That's a start, Marcus." "I'm not calling to ask for anything," he said quickly. "Not money, not forgiveness, not even a conversation if you're not ready. I wanted you to know that I see it now, that I see you, not as my personal maid or my trust fund or my anything, as Dorothy Hamilton, who built her own fortune and chose her own life and deserved a hell of a lot better than what I gave her." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of 45 years of motherhood, of love and disappointment and hope despite everything. "Thank you for calling, Marcus," I said finally. "That took courage." "Maybe someday," he started, then stopped. "No, that's not fair to put on you. Just be well, Mom. Enjoy Phoenix. Enjoy your freedom. You earned it 1,000 times over." After he hung up, I sat in the darkness for a long time. Through my window, I could see the lights of Phoenix spreading toward the mountains, a glittering reminder of how far I'd traveled, not just in miles, but in spirit. The secret was fully out now. Not just the money, but the deeper truth it represented. That a woman's worth wasn't measured in the services she provided or the sacrifices she made, but in her inalienable right to choose her own path, even at 70. Especially at 70. I returned to the piano, starting the sonata again from the beginning. This time, my fingers found more of the right notes. Progress, Elena would say. Slow but steady progress. Outside, the desert night bloomed, with possibilities. Inside, Dorothy Hamilton, former maid, secret millionaire, Phoenix risen from the ashes of other people's expectations, played on, creating her own music at last. The laminated schedules were long gone, torn up and discarded, with all the other assumptions about what a mother owed, what a woman should accept, what age meant for ambition and autonomy. In their place was something infinitely more valuable, a life of my own making, in a place of my own choosing, with wealth that was finally, openly, unapologetically mine to use as I pleased. And if someday Marcus had truly learned the lessons that his crisis had forced upon him, if he could approach me as equals rather than as servant and served, then perhaps we could build something new. Not the relationship he'd assumed was his by birthright, but one earned through mutual respect and genuine understanding. But that was a question for another day, another month, another year. Tonight, there was music to practice, stars to observe, through my telescope, and the simple, profound pleasure of going to bed whenever I chose, in sheets I'd selected, in a home no one could take away. The maid was gone forever. Dorothy Hamilton was home at last. And the view from here? It was spectacular. 2 years after leaving Ohio, I stood in my Phoenix kitchen, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for the first time since my escape. The turkey was smaller than the ones I used to make, appropriate for the intimate gathering, rather, than the productions I'd orchestrated for decades. Through the window, I could see the McDowell Mountains wearing their November colors, so different from Ohio's autumn palette. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock. When I opened it, Marcus stood on my doorstep, holding a pie carrier and looking simultaneously older and younger than when I'd last seen him. The arrogance had been replaced by something harder earned: humility. "Hi, Mom," he said simply. "I brought pumpkin pie, made it myself." "You baked?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "YouTube University," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "Took 3 attempts. Turns out cooking requires actual attention to instructions. Who knew?" I stepped aside to let him in. This visit had been months in the making, preceded by weekly phone calls where we'd slowly rebuilt communication. Not the relationship we'd had before, that was gone forever, but something new, more honest. "The place looks great," he said, taking in the condo. "Very you," meaning elegant but understated, quality without ostentation. He paused. Everything I missed before because I was too busy seeing what I expected to see. Linda and Michael arrived shortly after, my older children exchanging careful glances as they watched Marcus and me navigate our rebuilt dynamic. The 4 of us hadn't been together since Robert's funeral, back when I was still the invisible mother, the taken-for-granted provider of services and support. "Should we eat first or get the awkwardness out of the way?" Linda asked with characteristic directness. "Both?" Michael suggested. "Multitasking runs in the family." As we settled around my dining table, sized for chosen gatherings rather than obligatory ones, I watched my children interact. The dynamic had shifted. Marcus, once the entitled baby, now listened more than he spoke. His updates about his business came with self-deprecating humor rather than grandiose claims. "I actually have to thank you, Mom," he said over salad. "If you hadn't cut me off completely, I'd probably still be failing at get-rich-quick schemes and blaming everyone else." Rock bottom has its uses, I agreed, though I wouldn't recommend it as a first resort. "The cleaning schedule is now legendary in our family," Linda added. "My teenagers reference it whenever they think I'm being demanding. At least Mom's not laminating our chores like Uncle Marcus." Marcus winced but laughed. "I've become a cautionary tale." "Fair enough. Though I did frame one of those schedules. Keeps me humble." This was the Marcus I'd hoped to see emerge. Someone who could acknowledge his failures without drowning in them, who could laugh at his former blindness while working to see more clearly. After dinner, as Linda and Michael cleared dishes, without being asked, without a schedule, Marcus and I stepped onto the balcony. The November evening was perfect. Warm, enough for comfort, cool enough to hint at seasons change. "I never apologized properly," he said, looking out at the mountains. "For planning to put you in that home? For treating you like staff? For assuming I was entitled to everything you'd built?" "You've apologized multiple times," I reminded him. "But not adequately. How do you apologize for fundamental disrespect? For looking at your own mother and seeing only what she could do for you?" I considered this. "Maybe you don't. Maybe you just live differently and let that be your apology." He nodded slowly. "I'm trying. The business is actually helping, showing other people how to rebuild after financial collapse. Turns out I'm uniquely qualified to understand that particular crisis. Your father would appreciate the irony. He would have hated what I became, Marcus said quietly. But maybe he'd recognize who I'm trying to be now. Inside, Linda was regaling Michael with stories from her latest medical conference. Their laughter drifted through the glass doors, the sound of adult children who'd found their own happiness independent of parental provision. I've been thinking about secrets, Marcus continued, about how you hid your wealth for so long. I used to be angry about that, felt betrayed, deceived. But now, I think I understand. If I'd known, I would have been even worse. The entitlement would have been unbearable. For both of us, I agreed. Do you regret keeping it secret? I thought about this often. I regret that secrecy became necessary. But the secret itself? No. It gave me freedom when I needed it most. We returned inside to find Linda and Michael deep in debate about cryptocurrency. Linda skeptical, Michael cautiously optimistic. They turned to me automatically. "Mom, you're the financial genius," Michael said. "Settle this for us." "Some things each generation has to figure out for themselves," I said. "Besides, my investment strategy is decidedly old school. Buy quality, hold forever, live below your means, and keep it all secret until someone tries to turn you into unpaid help," Marcus added. "Then sell everything and move to Phoenix." The room went quiet for a moment, everyone gauging whether this joke landed safely. When I laughed, the tension broke. "Exactly," I said. "I'll add that to my investment book." Chapter 10. When to Deploy. The Nuclear Option. As the evening wound down, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Completion. Not perfection, but the satisfying sense of a circle closed properly. My children were launched, truly launched this time. My freedom was secured and cherished. And Marcus was finally becoming the man he might have been all along if privilege hadn't poisoned his perspective. "Same time next year?" Linda asked as they prepared to leave. "Actually," Marcus said hesitantly, "I was thinking maybe Christmas? If Mom's willing, I could come a few days early, help with preparations. As a guest," he added quickly, not expecting anything, just participating. I looked at my youngest child, 47 years old and finally growing up. The mother in me wanted to say yes immediately. The woman who'd scrubbed his toilets while he planned my institutional future needed more time. "Ask me in a few months," I said. "Let's see how Thanksgiving settles first." He nodded, understanding this was growth but not full reconciliation. "Fair enough. Thank you for today, Mom, for the chance to start over." After they left, I stood in my quiet condo, surrounded by the remnants of a successful gathering. No laminated schedule told me when to clean up. No entitled voice would critique my hosting. I was Dorothy Hamilton in my own space, on my own terms, with my own choices. I'd sold a house but found a home, lost a maid's position but gained a life, and maybe, just maybe, transformed a spoiled son into someone worth knowing. The money had made it possible, but the courage to use it had made it real. And that secret, the power of knowing your own worth, was one I'd never need to hide again. Outside, the Phoenix night bloomed with stars I'd learned to name, mysteries I'd finally had time to explore. Tomorrow, there would be pickleball and piano practice, Helen's garden and book club debates. But tonight, there was just satisfaction. The maid was gone. The mother remained. And Dorothy Hamilton? She was exactly where she wanted to be, the author of her own story at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.